Danny Heinrich is no longer a person of interest. He is the confessed murderer of Jacob Wetterling.
An announcement Minnesotans waited 27 years to hear. Hard to put the emotion into words. For Noreen Gosch,
thank God. So the family will have some closure. Because it's hard to go on day after day, year after year, with nothing.
Gosch hopes to have her own resolve someday. Her son, Johnny Gosch, disappeared in 1982.
Police are looking for this boy, 12-year-old Johnny Gosch.
On Sunday morning, September 5, 1982, the streets of West Des Moines, Iowa were dark. It was 5:45 a.m. Like every Sunday, 12-year-old Johnny Gosch grabbed his canvas delivery bags without waking his sleeping parents. He loaded his red wagon and stepped off his front porch into the cool air. He had company. Walking right next to him was the family's small dachshund, Gretchen. Johnny knew his neighborhood, he knew his customers, and he never missed a delivery. He walked down to the corner of 42nd Street and Marcourt Lane. There, he met up with another paperboy named Mike Suko. The two boys began folding newspapers beneath the orange glow of a street lamp. As they worked, a blue or silver Ford Fairmont slowed almost to a stop along the curb. A man stepped out, walked up to the boys, and asked for long, confusing directions. A few minutes later, the boys finished folding and split up to hit their separate streets. Johnny pulled his wagon into the dark to finish his route. But someone else came home. At 6:30 a.m., Gretchen the dachshund ran back to the Gosch house alone. She scratched frantically at the wooden front door. Johnny wasn't with her. He never would be again. When his terrified parents called the local police department, they expected flashing lights and an immediate emergency response. Instead, they ran into a devastating barrier. Officers initially treated Johnny as a likely runaway instead of launching an immediate abduction investigation, delaying critical early action. That response started a 40-year nightmare and launched a mother's long war against a system that chose to wait. Today, we're looking directly into the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. Let's look at the timeline together, track his steps backward, and figure out exactly where the trail went cold. Let me know in the comments what you think happened. Before we get into the police logs, take a second to hit the subscribe button. It helps keep these stories alive so these kids are never forgotten. To figure out how a child vanishes from a quiet neighborhood without making a sound, detectives later tried to rebuild Johnny's final known movements. If you trace the clock backward, the window of opportunity is incredibly narrow. Johnny pulled his red wagon through the quiet neighborhood, his dog Gretchen trotting right along beside him. When he reached the corner of 42nd and Marcourt, Mike Suko was already waiting. Under the dim glow of the street lamp, the two boys cut the wire ties on the heavy newspaper bundles and started folding the morning editions. That's when the headlights appeared. A silver Ford Fairmont crawled past the intersection, slowing almost to a stop before a man stepped out to ask them for directions. It felt strange, but the boys answered and went right back to work. Minutes later, they split up to hit their separate streets. As Mike walked away into the early morning mist, he glanced back one last time. Down the block, he saw Johnny standing next to a second, unidentified man. Johnny didn't look scared or panicked, so Mike turned the corner and kept moving. Detectives later asked an important question. Why would Johnny willingly speak to a stranger? Had the man mentioned a nearby address, claimed to be lost, pretended to know Johnny's father? No one knows. Mike turned the corner, assuming everything was fine. He had no idea he was the last person who would ever see his friend. Just 15 minutes later, the silence broke. Back at the Gosch home, Gretchen the dachshund was scratching frantically at the front door. Alone. Johnny. John Gosch Sr. shouted his son's name as he sprinted down the dark sidewalk. No answer. He kept running until he reached the corner. The wagon was still there, sitting completely alone under a street lamp. John reached into it. The Sunday papers were still stacked neatly inside, completely untouched. Johnny was gone. The breakdown in the police response started the moment Johnny's mother, Noreen Gosch, called the station at 8:30 a.m. Because the disappearance occurred during an era when teenagers frequently left home on their own accord, authorities did not immediately secure the area. Officers didn't block off the intersection. They didn't search the neighborhood for the silver Ford Fairmont, and they didn't write down the license plates of cars driving toward the nearby highway. The most critical hours of the search, the window where tire tracks, footprints, and witness memories are fresh, were lost. For 3 full days, while the investigation began to stall, the official file sat completely still. When the police finally accepted that a 12-year-old boy would not leave his beloved dog and an untouched wagon behind to run away, they tried to make up for lost time. However, the West Des Moines Police Department was not fully equipped or trained for a major stranger abduction investigation. Instead, the community took over. Hundreds of volunteers gathered at the United Methodist Church, where Johnny had folded his papers just hours earlier. They divided the map into a crude grid system, linking arms to walk through cornfields, drainage ditches, and the thick brush along the Raccoon River. They looked for torn clothing, dropped keys, or any sign of disturbed earth. Neighbors checked their own crawl spaces, detached garages, and backyard sheds, hoping Johnny had simply found a place to hide from the cold morning air. As the sun went down on that first Sunday, the search parties found absolutely nothing. Whoever abducted Johnny appeared to have operated in full view of an ordinary neighborhood. Yet investigators found almost nothing that could explain how he disappeared. By Monday morning, the FBI arrived to assist the local detectives, but the physical trail was already contaminated. Numerous volunteers had walked across the grass and pavements around the drop site, wiping away potential footprints or trace evidence that a modern forensic team could have collected. Investigators began interviewing the other paperboys who worked the surrounding routes, hoping someone else had seen the silver Ford Fairmont. While multiple kids remembered seeing a strange vehicle roaming the streets between 5:30 and 6:15 a.m., no one had written down a license plate number. The neighborhood had been too safe, the routine too familiar, for anyone to think they needed to watch the license plates of passing cars. When Johnny Gosch realized the local police were treating her son's case like a minor runaway issue, she made a clear decision. She bypassed law enforcement completely and turned the search into a nationwide movement. Noreen knew that if the system wouldn't look for Johnny, she had to make it impossible for the public to look away. She called the editors of the Des Moines Register and demanded daily news coverage. She turned her living room into a volunteer center. She ran search parties, raised money, and printed thousands of missing person flyers using her own savings. Then came an idea that changed how America looks for missing children. In late 1984, an employee at the Anderson Erickson Dairy in Des Moines suggested a new plan, printing the photos and descriptions of missing kids on the sides of half-gallon milk cartons. Within weeks, Johnny's face was staring back at millions of people across their breakfast tables every single morning. The response was massive, but this exposure came with a heavy cost. Night after night, Noreen sat beside the kitchen phone in a silent house. Every ring carried the hope that someone had finally found Johnny. More often than not, it was another prankster, another fake psychic, or another cruel lie. She hung up, her hands shaking, only for the phone to ring again minutes later. Every single call brought a wave of fear, followed by the realization that it was another dead end. But Noreen refused to change her number or stop. She stayed on national television and testified before Congress about child safety laws, forcing the government to acknowledge the gaps in how missing kids were tracked. The milk carton campaign quickly expanded far beyond the borders of Iowa. What started as a local project with Anderson Erickson Dairy was soon adopted by major regional distributors across the Midwest, including Prairie Farms and Roberts Dairy. Within months, the National Child Safety Council established a coordinated program that put the faces of missing children on billions of milk cartons distributed to corner stores and public school cafeterias in nearly every state. For the first time in history, a missing child from a small town in Iowa was a household name across the country. The back of the breakfast carton became a psychological fixture of 1980s American life. a daily reminder that danger could find a child even in the safest communities. But while the Cartons raised incredible public awareness, they also flooded the West Des Moines Police Department and the FBI with unmanageable data. The tip lines were overwhelmed with thousands of calls every week. People reported seeing boys who looked like Johnny in bus stations, rest stops, and grocery stores across the country. Every single tip had to be logged, categorized, and assigned to a field agent for follow-up, burning through valuable investigative hours. Most of these sightings turned out to be cases of mistaken identity, normal children traveling with their parents who happened to share Johnny's height and hair color. The massive wave of information created a secondary crisis for the detectives, who found themselves drowning in false leads while the case drifted further from answers with each passing month. Inside the Gosch home, the psychological toll of this national spotlight was suffocating. The phone lines were kept open 24 hours a day, monitored by recording equipment installed by law enforcement. The family could never escape the reality of the abduction. Extortionists called, claiming they had Johnny tied up in a basement and would kill him unless thousands of dollars were dropped at a specific highway marker. Law enforcement would rush to track the calls, only to discover the caller was a teenager looking for a cruel joke or a lonely individual seeking attention. Noreen learned to steel herself against these voices, developing a clinical detachment just to survive the nights. She realized that the public interest was a double-edged sword. It kept Johnny's name alive, but it also invited the darkest elements of human nature directly into her kitchen. For 2 years, the people of Des Moines tried to move on. They told themselves that Johnny's case was a one-time tragedy that would never happen again. Then, history repeated itself. On August 12, 1984, the fear came back. It was another Sunday morning. 13-year-old Eugene Martin was delivering papers on his route in South Des Moines when he vanished. His delivery bag and papers were found dropped near an intersection. Phones started ringing across Des Moines. Parents woke their children early. Newspaper carriers refused to work alone. Everyone remembered Johnny. Another paperboy was gone. Same city, same job, same early morning hours, same age. 2 boys disappeared doing the exact same job. Yet the first investigation waited, while the second one didn't. The difference depended on nothing more than a city boundary. Because Eugene disappeared in South Des Moines, the case went to the Des Moines Police Department, a totally separate agency from the West Des Moines Police who had handled Johnny's case. The Des Moines Police Department had spent 2 years watching the public anger over the Gosch investigation, and they refused to make the same mistake. The moment Eugene's parents called, the police threw out the waiting periods. Within an hour, they sent out alerts, put hundreds of officers on the streets, set up physical checkpoints on the roads, and brought the FBI into the case that afternoon. The public reaction to Eugene Martin's disappearance was fast and terrified. The entire culture of the city shifted in 24 hours. Parents who had previously allowed their children to walk to school, play in neighborhood parks, or ride their bikes down suburban streets suddenly locked their doors. The local newspapers were filled with articles advising parents on how to protect their kids from an unseen predator who seemed to know the city's layouts. The casual freedom of Midwestern childhood vanished. Independent newspaper routes, once considered a classic rite of passage, were suddenly seen as a direct path into danger. Adults began driving their children along their paper routes, sitting in the driver's seat with the engine idling, while their sons ran the Sunday editions to front porches. Neighbors formed localized watch groups, patrolling the streets in personal vehicles between the hours of 4 and 7 a.m. Any unfamiliar car idling near a curb or moving at a slow pace was immediately reported to the police. The atmosphere in Des Moines became deeply defensive, defined by an intense suspicion of strangers. But even with the massive police and FBI search for Eugene, investigators hit the exact same wall. The abductor appeared to leave almost no trace, leaving no footprints, no fingerprints, and no clues. The similarities between the 2 disappearances raised the disturbing possibility that the same offender, or someone using the same method, was targeting paperboys. The Joint Task Force reviewed thousands of hours of local records, searching for a thread that connected the two boys' routes. They looked at delivery schedules, corporate truck routes, and public utility workers who had access to the neighborhoods in the early morning hours, but every single line of inquiry ended in a dead end. Months became years. Years became decades. And with every passing lead that went nowhere, something else filled the void: rumors. Without physical evidence, the search entered a new phase, one increasingly dominated by dark stories and conspiracy theories. To look at this era clearly, we have to separate what is proven from what is just talk. It is a proven fact that a set of photographs existed and was left on Noreen Gosch's doorstep. The 3 Polaroid pictures showed a young boy who looked like Johnny, tied up in a dark room with other children. Experts looked at the film. Because it was blurry and had no clear background objects, the police couldn't prove it was Johnny, and they couldn't prove it wasn't. The pictures became another dead end. It is also a proven fact that specific legal testimonies happened. In the early 90s, the case took a weird turn. An inmate named Paul Bonacci stood up in court and swore under oath that he was actually part of a multi-state kidnapping ring. He claimed he was standing right there on the street corner on the morning of September 5, 1982, and helped kidnap Johnny Gosch. But here is what is completely unverified. Police departments and federal investigators checked Bonacci's story thoroughly. They concluded that his claims lacked any real, independent physical evidence to back them up. His stories about a large trafficking network involving powerful politicians have never been proven by any court or federal investigation. The legal proceedings involving Paul Bonacci took place within the context of a civil lawsuit filed in Lincoln, Nebraska. The case attracted massive media attention because it threatened to link the disappearance of a paperboy in Iowa to a much larger scandal. Bonacci provided specific details about the layout of the streets in West Des Moines, the appearance of the silver Ford Fairmont, and the mechanics of how Johnny was allegedly taken from the curb. He claimed that Johnny had been targeted because of his routine schedule and that the abduction was planned well in advance. Because Bonacci was an inmate with a complex psychological history, federal prosecutors approached his testimony with extreme caution. The FBI spent months trying to verify the logistics of his claims. They checked his travel records, his associates, and his known locations in September 1982. Ultimately, the official task force determined that while Bonacci possessed an unusual amount of knowledge about the case file, his story could not be verified by any secondary witness, financial record, or physical piece of evidence. The allegations of high-level government cover-ups and underground networks remained confined to the civil deposition transcripts, never crossing the threshold into a criminal court. For Noreen Gosch, this period was an exhausting exercise in legal frustration. She attended the hearings, read the transcripts, and listened to the horrific descriptions of what may have happened to her son. She was forced to confront a system that seemed entirely unable to give her a straight answer. The local authorities maintained that Bonacci was an unreliable witness spinning a complex hoax, while independent investigators argued that his testimony contained details that had never been released to the public. The case file became deeply compromised by these conflicting narratives, leaving the family trapped in a permanent state of legal ambiguity. In 1997, 15 years after Johnny vanished, the story took its most talked-about turn. It remains one of the most debated moments in the history of the case. According to Noreen Gosch, she was sitting in her apartment in the middle of the night when she heard a knock on the front door. When she opened it, she saw a young man accompanied by another man who stood silently down the hall. Noreen stated that the man walked inside, unbuttoned his shirt to show a specific birthmark on his chest, and looked at her. She fully believed it was Johnny, now an adult. Noreen claimed they sat in her living room for over an hour, and he told her that he had survived his years in captivity, but was still being watched and threatened. He allegedly told her he couldn't come home for good, or tell the police without putting both of their lives in danger. Then, he stood up and walked away into the night. But this story is deeply disputed. Johnny's father, John Gosch Sr., publicly disagreed with the account. He stated that the story did not align with the actual facts or evidence gathered by investigators over the years. On top of that, the West Des Moines Police Department and the FBI looked into the claim. Because there were no other witnesses, no security video, and no physical evidence left behind in the apartment, law enforcement officially stated they had zero proof that the visit ever happened. The public announcement of this alleged visit completely divided the true crime community and the remaining investigators on the case. For those who believed Noreen, the story was a validation of her decades of work, proof that Johnny was alive and that her maternal instincts had been right all along. They pointed to her detailed description of the adult man's physical features and his knowledge of private family matters as proof that the encounter was authentic. For the critics and official investigators, the story was viewed as a deeply tragic psychological milestone. They argued that 15 years of continuous, high-intensity trauma, combined with the endless stream of hoaxes and false leads, had taken a devastating toll on a grieving mother's mind. They pointed out that an adult escapee under threat would likely not risk a physical visit to a highly monitored apartment building, nor would they leave without leaving behind a single trace of DNA or physical proof that the police could use. Whether that night really happened remains impossible to prove, but it forever changed how Johnny's story would be remembered. It broke the family's unified front, leaving two parents to deal with the loss of their son from two completely different perspectives. John Gosch Sr. eventually distanced himself from the public campaigns, choosing to process his grief away from the media spotlight, while Noreen continued to speak at safety conferences, her belief in her son's survival completely unshaken by the official skepticism of the state. Even though the actual fate of Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin remains a mystery, the legal changes that came from their era completely changed child safety laws. To understand how America changed its laws, you have to look at three separate cases that happened around the same time. The first major shift began in May 1979 with the disappearance of Etan Patz in New York. At the time, there was no way for police departments to track missing children across state lines, a failure that directly inspired the first national television and milk carton awareness campaigns. Just 2 years later, in July 1981, the abduction of Adam Walsh in Florida exposed another massive flaw, as local police forces routinely treated child abductions like standard family arguments, eventually forcing the creation of automated store alerts like Code Adam. Finally, the abduction of Johnny Gosch in Iowa targeted the delays that kept police from taking immediate action. Before these three cases, local police departments in different states did not share information, and there was no central computer database to track missing kids. If a kidnapper crossed a state line, the chase stopped. The lack of a centralized national network meant that an abductor could commit a crime in one state and drive into another with absolute confidence that the local state troopers had no idea a child was missing. Noreen Gosch's advocacy became one of the driving forces behind Iowa's missing child reforms. In 1984, her relentless work heavily influenced the passage of Johnny's Law in Iowa. This law got rid of the old rules. It banned the mandatory waiting periods for missing children, legally forcing police officers to start an active search the exact minute a child was reported missing. It stopped the automatic assumption that missing kids were just runaways. The law also established a statewide missing person clearinghouse within the Department of Public Safety to share photos and physical data immediately across the state. The momentum from this triad of separate tragedies forced the federal government to step in, leading to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, in 1984. The slow, disconnected response of 1982 was replaced by a fast national network, setting the stage for the modern Amber Alert system and immediate federal help. NCMEC established a 24-hour national toll-free hotline, created specialized forensic teams that could deploy to local jurisdictions instantly, and standardized the technical training for local law enforcement handling high-risk abductions. On that September morning, 44 years ago, one red wagon sat abandoned on a quiet sidewalk. Today, the milk cartons with Johnny's face are gone, and the paperboys who used to work in the dark are adults. 4 decades later, no one knows where Johnny's journey ended, but because of him, millions of missing children are searched for immediately. Somewhere, Johnny's story has an ending. It's just one the world has never found. Thank you for watching this case file. If Johnny's story mattered to you, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss our next video. Every single name in these files deserves to be remembered. We will see you in the next case.